there are traditions of dealing with the past in Northern Ireland, in Ireland, and very rarely are these consulted when we think about dealing with the past. It's all these kind of modern politics. But society has been dealing with the past since whenever. And that's something we've got to think about. We've got to take kind of this long duration and look at the indigenous sources that are in society of dealing with the past. So that's some of the topics that I'd like to deal with today. Hence, what might seem complicated, what I'd like to do here in general is to say one of the things that academics are very good at is mystification. We write big titles and they mystify. I think one of our tasks is actually demystification. We've got to kind of break up these titles and explain these are very simple notions. They might seem like complicated notions, they're very simple. Anybody can relate to them. It doesn't have to be, and I was happy to hear here that it's not just academics in this room, that it's a mix from different places. Because the debate shouldn't be an academic debate, proper. And it is remarkable to be saying these things in this room, specifically, with all the pictures around and the ghosts which are here, which is remarkable, which we've heard about. So the subtitle for the book is Social Forgetting and Vernacular Historiography of Rebellion in Ulster. So what are these terms? Vernacular historiography sounds like a very complicated term. But in general, what I'm trying to say is that there's vernacular, local traditions of telling history. And they deserve to be counted as a historiography like any other historiography. It's not just academics that write history that turns into historiography because it's constantly being rewritten. Communities have been doing that all the time in different forms and different media. We've got to take that into the past. Take that into account when we deal with the past, That's something we've got to deal with. Academics, it's always too easy just to read historians about history. It's just part of the picture. It's just part of the source material we should be looking at. And if we do that, and we look at traditions specifically in Northern Ireland, but in other places, we might encounter something remarkable. And that maybe is the theoretical novelty of this book. We might encounter a phenomena called social forgetting. Well, it's a term that I've coined, but I'm going to explain what it means. So let me break for you this term, just so we do a bit of theory and then we'll delve into the practice. So I know that theory is supposed to be kept at Queen's, at Ulster University. We don't do this in everyday life, but it's not true. Theory can be dealt in every way. So let's look at what I mean by social forgetting. Let's just clarify the terms so we'll be on equal ground here. What do I mean by social forgetting? First of all, it's important to understand I refer to intentional forgetting. What happens when you want to forget something on purpose? There's a whole field in psychology of deliberate forgetting, when you have embarrassing things that you don't want. And it's a very problematic field. I'll give some examples maybe if there's time. But it's a certain case, because it's not passive forgetting. All the time we forget things. It's not about where I put my keys. It's about saying this is something I don't want, it's embarrassing, it's unpleasant, I'm going to try and forget it if I can. That's important to remember. Now, forgetting is very important in history. Historians haven't even begun to study properly forgetting. Most of history we'd like to think was remembered and the exception was forgetting. That's not true. Most of history was forgotten. The exception is what we remember and record. In any given day, we forget almost everything that happened during that day, that we've seen during that day, and remember very little. So I'm not dealing with the things which have been forgotten completely. I'm dealing with something very specific here. And the next point I'd like to say is this is a social process as far as I'm concerned. This is not an individual process. It's about people together, a community, a society, trying to forget events. In that sense, I'm talking about social forgetting and putting it in tandem with social memory. A community can remember in different forms, or groups can remember in different forms, and they can also forget. Now, social memory is a term which is perhaps less familiar than collective memory. I don't like using the term collective memory. It's more popular to use it, it's more common, but I think it's also a misleading term. Sometimes I use it for very specific situations. Collective memory gives us the illusion that we remember as a collective, in a homogeneous way, as a group. We all have the same memory. That's very rare. It's always contested. There's always a hierarchy. There's always people who have more cultural capital, if you wish, or more invested in the memory and want to influence others. People who are being pushed out. Collective memory also has this notion of top-down. The government decides for us, or a group or an elite decides, and people just receive it. That's not how it works. And it's important to remember that. Because the correlative, if we have this notion of collective memory, then we'll expect to see collective amnesia. And I'm not talking about collective amnesia because whenever I've looked at cases, and hence my interest, by the way, in the Spanish flu, and in many other cases, for years now I've been looking at different cases around the world of cases which we think have been forgotten. What does that mean? And the important thing to remember is memory doesn't work like a light bulb. So I asked where the light switch is here. We'd like to think that we can switch off a light and switch it on. And that's how memory works. It doesn't. You don't switch on memory. And you don't just switch it off one day and it disappears. It's a process. And things stay as we go along. So not only is it not collective amnesia, that something is just kind of collectively, we decide to forget something and it just happens. And I'll explain what does happen, what I think happens as we go along. And it's also not total oblivion. It's not pressing delete and it disappears. Inevitably, whenever I've looked at cases where we think something has been forgotten in history deliberately, the picture, the more we dig into it, the more complicated it gets. We'll look at one case together here. So the dynamic I'm looking towards is a process of disremembering. We're trying to put aside something, to disremember it. But the more I look at it, I realize that disremembering is actually a form of remembrance. It's a very strange form of remembrance, and it's actually more prevalent than we think. We do a lot of disremembering, we just don't think about it. And we haven't studied as historians. We've got to think what that means in terms of our history. Just to use another term before we move on and put theory aside for a bit, but I think we should always think about what the wider implications. Because this is bigger than Northern Ireland. And Northern Ireland also plays a big part in it. Often we'll hear the term of popular memory. Sounds great, popular memory. The problem with popular memory is, and this is where we relate to the opposite, there's also unpopular memories. And this, it might take me a strong effort to explain that in various forums. In Northern Ireland, I think I don't have a problem explaining that. What is popular for one group is unpopular for another group. There's people inside and there's people outside. So it's always contested. And so a lot of social forgetting or disremembering is trying to wipe out the narrative of the other group, or things which are not convenient for you. So you've got to think of these terms. In general, what do I mean by social forgetting? And you'll see these kind of captions which relate to the poster here, and the kind of, in a nutshell, if you wish, synopsis of various chapters in the book, which are demonstrated in great detail, but if you want to know kind of the thesis behind it, the key point is I'm saying that social forgetting, if you want a definition, a quick definition, it's a complicated term. It's what happens when a community tries to put aside discomforting events in its past, events which are no longer convenient. Now this complicates the whole field of memory studies, because for the last 30 years I've been told time and time again, I read constantly works on memory studies, and there's thousands of them. I'm always told that memory is about the present more than it is about the past. Our present needs form our memory of the past. If so, if something is inconvenient now, then it should be forgotten with no problem. But it doesn't work like that. It's much more complicated, the relationship between present and past. What I would add here is that, social forgetting actually creates a different dynamic. It's the dynamic of saying we forgot something, professing publicly we forgot about it, not talking about it in public, but talking about it behind closed doors. Speaking about it in private forums, in local forums. This is what's interesting, this kind of tension. And this happens. And we can think about different scenarios. Sometimes it happens unconsciously. The classic example of what disremembering is, the judge, we've all seen this, maybe not personally, but we've seen it at least in American dramas on TV. The judge instructs the jury, this is inadmissible, this piece of evidence, strike it off the record, forget it. Will that evidence be forgotten during the proceedings? It won't be spoken about, because everybody's going to try very hard not to speak about it. But it's going to stay there as an elephant in the room. In a way, this is about the elephants in the room that are there, and how we deal with them, that we don't speak about them and discuss them maybe behind closed doors or in our mind. So it's this tension between public forgetting, sometimes reticence, sometimes silencing. It might be enforced that we're not allowed to talk about these topics. And between private and local remembrance. And we have a challenge as historians, and as people interested in the past. How do we get to these hidden histories? How do we find this private local remembrance? For years I was told as a student, you can't get to that. It's a great question, Guy, but you can't get to that because history is about the winners writing history, you only get the public narratives. That's not true. And it's definitely not true in Northern Ireland, where there's so much documentation, where the sources are so rich, but it's not true in practically every society. Just have to find other ways. And that's why we need a term like vernacular historiography. In the past, I used the term folk history. I specialized in folklore in order to try and access stories which were less seen by historians. I'm using the term folk history less now, only for certain circumstances, because folk history is very good with oral traditions, how we work with oral narratives that went through time. That's folklore. But it's not just folklore. Folklore likes to say we look at the oral world, not at print. But a lot of this is in print. A lot of material is in print and not looked at. Works of antiquarians, local historians, travel books, books of poetry, books of literature, they're full of history. This is all part of vernacular historiography. A lot of it relates to artifacts, material culture. The objects we find in museums and in folk museums and people's homes, which can tell us a lot about the past. Visual material. So I'm going to give you a little flavor of some of this material. But the bottom line is that when I went to look at this study and chose a case which people told me has been forgotten in Northern Ireland, not only has it been forgotten, by going through a process of social forgetting and trying to access and follow this process, I had to turn to vernacular historiography. And suddenly I found that I have thousands of sources. Not hundreds, thousands. So there's lots of sources. You just have to access them. And I'll show some of them as we go along. So, we're going to delve into the issue closer now, but I'm going back to the title of the talk. I explained the term disremembering, but I have one more comment about the term disremembering. It sounds like a very strong academic term, disremembering, kind of like postmodernism or something. We should be careful about that. Disremembering is a vernacular term. From here, if you look at works of antiquarians, you look at how speech was used in Ulster 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago. Patterson, for example, famous antiquarian in Belfast in his day in the early 20th century, up until the early 20th century, in his glossary of words in use in counties Antrim and Down, disremember is used as a synonym for forgetting. Even more interesting is this glossary of Ulster speech from 1910 by Beiner, because it has a few meanings. One is to forget, be unable to recall. But this is where idiom comes in. And this is where Ulster speech becomes remarkably interesting. It's also used to pretend to forget. Be unwilling or inclined not to remember. Get your head around that one. And that maybe says it all. Because the more you look at disremembering and at social forgetting, you see that it's actually an act. It's a charade. It's a masquerade. It's feigned forgetting. You say we forget something, but you remember it at the same time. And that opens a whole new path of inquiry, which is fantastic. This kind of veiled form of social remembrance. It's not the parades. It's not the things that catch the headlines. It's not the big statues. It's the stories that you tell which supposedly have been forgotten. And there are a lot of these stories around on many areas. You can take this in many different paths. So, with that in mind, let's look at 98 in the United Irish past. And this is worthwhile, I think, for a few reasons. Is exactly because what we don't have in a lot of discussions on the past is historical perspective. When we talk about the Troubles, they're close. We think that we're away from them, but they're still too close. They're still too fresh. They're next to us. Any statement we make about the Troubles is a statement about today and who we are now. We don't have perspective. We can take the decade of centenaries. That gives us 100 years perspective. Also not that much. United Irishman is interesting because it gives us 2 centuries, more than 2 centuries, where we can follow the development of social forgetting and social remembrance, of memory and forgetting, over 2 centuries, and we can see the dynamics of how it goes up and down, and it's a complicated story. And that's what makes it interesting. So sometimes we need historical perspective. Last comment before we actually follow social forgetting is that the United Irishmen are interesting for several reasons. But one, if we return to the radical moment from which they emerged, they themselves engaged in dealing with the past. One of the famous, quoted a lot during the time of the bicentennial, one of the famous manifestos that comes out in the proceedings of one of the early meetings in Dublin in 1791 with a famous quote. They're looking at the past. We have thought little about our ancestors, much of our posterity. Are we forever to walk like beasts of prey over fields which these ancestors stained with blood? So it's exactly about dealing with the past and trying to put a difficult past away. And exactly, they're suggesting that perhaps we should choose silence, a very typical way of looking at it. We see this and are silent, but we gladly look forward to brighter prospects, to a people united in the fellowship of freedom. So to put aside difficult pasts. But by doing that, they were also creating new difficult pasts.